Now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's first speaker, Tony Incalterra, SVP with Ipsos's Audience Measurement Team. Tony, you have the floor.
Thank you, Megan. I appreciate your setting this up, and thank you everyone for attending. I'm going to turn my webcam off so that you can focus on the slides, and we've got a lot to cover, so let's get started. So the first thing I wanted to do, I really wanted to start off big, and that really is all about showing you just how important the affluent market is. There's a real economic impact that they have on the wine and spirits business. When we look at data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, their consumer expenditure report, we see very clearly that affluent households spend more than $30 billion a year on alcoholic beverages. We're going to get more into the specifics shortly, but now that we've got your attention about how important it is, let's give you a little bit of background about what you're going to see today and hear today. So the insights that we're going to present are primarily derived from three sources. One, our ongoing Ipsos Affluence Study USA, along with an in-depth study that we conduct every quarter as part of our barometer series. The U.S. Affluence Survey is part of Ipsos's 49-country effort to provide clients really with a total understanding of affluent consumers, who they are, what they buy, what they use, how they think, and ultimately how to effectively reach and speak to them in the most persuasive way. We're pleased today to also share great insights about the spirits industry from our colleagues who run the Ipsos Alcohol Consumption Tracking Study, which is a continuously fielded study among all adults of drinking age. Now, the Ipsos Affluent Survey is the longest running and most comprehensive study about affluent Americans. It started way back in 1978, and it's been running for 46 years. That allows us to really have an unparalleled view into how affluence have changed over the past 5 decades. Most importantly, it allows us to speak today about where they stand in their media and purchasing behaviors, as well as their attitudes and preferences. So the survey itself is conducted online 24/7, 365 days a year, and it covers everything from automotive ownership and purchase intent to the makeup and strength of their financial portfolios. And of course, we focus a good amount of the survey on one of the things most near and dear to affluent hearts, which is entertaining and alcohol beverage consumption. Now, as I mentioned before, we're really pleased to have developed this webinar in concert with our Ipsos colleagues who run ACT, the Alcohol Consumption Tracker. And here's Asad Amin to tell you a little bit more about that study.
Thanks, Tony. So the ACT study, or ACT, basically captures the final stage of the consumer journey, and it really focuses on consumption behavior when it comes to alcohol. We're been in existence to actually close to a decade now. And what we do is we capture information on consumption over the course of a month. So our respondents complete a survey over the entire month on their overall consumption of alcohol. And it's a fairly large, robust, and representative sample that not only looks at each of these occasions and demographics, but allows us to really look at drinking rates, cross-consumption behavior, and intensity. And it's got a fairly large, robust usage of brands and capture there as well. For this particular presentation, what we've done is we've looked at income earners of 125,000 plus to match with the affluent study. And that's where we're going to understand their alcohol consumption behavior accordingly. Tony, back to you.
So we've got a lot to cover today, which we normally do with these webinars, but we're going to start with explaining why affluents are such an important target for marketers, especially today, given what is happening in the world around us. We're going to provide some insight into the affluent mindset as it is today. This is data that was collected in the first half of November, so it's quite recent information. It was conducted before and during the election, so we'll have a little bit of information from that perspective. And then we're going to give you some essential information on alcohol consumption by affluents. Assad is going to present some really interesting findings on consumption trends that have formed over the last couple of years. We're then going to switch over to talk about the importance of food as it relates to alcohol consumption, before spending a little bit more time focusing in on the consumption of wine among affluents. And after that, we'll focus on spirits and get into a little bit of information about the generational differences. We'll then attempt to sum everything up in some key takeaways for you all. So let's start by looking today at why affluents are so important to virtually every aspect of the U.S. economy. And it's actually pretty simple. It all comes down to the fact that this relatively small portion of the population controls the vast majority of wealth in the country. They possess $94 trillion of wealth, almost 7 in every $10 of wealth in the U.S. Now, in the last 2 quarters, there's been a drop in overall net worth, but that's primarily due to declines on Wall Street, something that impacts affluent households to a much greater degree than non-affluent households. But the fact remains that the top 20% of U.S. households still have more than 3/4 of the non-real estate assets in the country. And therefore, they're far more liquid than the non-affluent population. That effectively means they have the wherewithal to spend, and quite honestly, they do. So in terms of today's topic, alcoholic beverages, one of the things we see is that the top 20% of the population spends almost as much as the other 80%. As I mentioned earlier, it's slightly more than $30 billion a year. Now, on average, that means that affluent households outspend non-affluent households almost 4 times. And this is specifically on beer, wine, and spirits. Now, given how important these folks are to the market, we thought it'd be a good idea to take you back a little bit and give you a sense of the temperature of affluence, how they're gauging the current circumstances, and what this might mean for purchases both short-term and longer-term. Now, we've been taking the pulse of affluent feelings about the economy for the past 13 years in our barometer series. For most of this time, affluents have been largely optimistic. They feel that the economy is in a good place moving forward. During the Great Recession, we did see brief times of bears overtaking bulls in terms of economic outlook. But once we got past the Great Recession, optimism really triumphed over pessimism. That was until COVID hit in 2020. Thankfully, it was a relatively short period of pessimism outweighing optimism. Really, as people adjusted to the changing times, optimism returned until historically high inflation really hit us earlier this year. So when we look at the most recent results, what we're seeing is that pessimism about the economy has outweighed optimism 44% to 33%. However, most of this pessimism is still centered around the mass affluent population, as the ones with higher incomes are more likely to see a positive outlook for the economy. It's not great, but it is better. In fact, among those households with a household net worth of $5 million or more, nearly half of those people are bullish on the U.S. economy. So we do see that the financial insulation that affluents have definitely changes their perspective of the future. But that said, the reality is that there are still concerns about inflation that are affecting all income levels. The three biggest issues in this quarter, based on the survey results, were clearly on the ballot in November, and they didn't go unnoticed by affluents. Historic levels of inflation, a sense of the U.S. economy difficulties that are ahead of us, and not surprisingly, given the rhetoric that was surrounding the midterm elections, there's a great deal of concern about political polarization. Now, inflation was the #1 issue cited by affluents in this Q4 barometer, both as the #1 issue on its own and then one of the top 3 issues. So we often talk about the financial insulation that affluents enjoy relative to the rest of the country. But despite that insulation, the reality is that the majority of affluents still expect that rising prices and inflation will change their buying habits over the course of the next few months. Now, of course, non-affluent households are even more likely to say that they're going to change their spending habits as prices rise. So how is this going to impact purchasing behavior? Well, around half of affluents say they'll purchase fewer products, with a similar number saying they'll search for sales and promotions when buying. Now, these two approaches are even more likely among non-affluents. As we look further, about 4 in 10 affluents and non-affluent households say they'll wait and they'll buy items when they go on sale. Non-affluents are far more likely to say that they are going to buy cheaper brands and private label brands, while an equal number of affluent and non-affluents say they're likely to cut back on things like streaming services and media subscriptions. But the reality is that's not all bad news. It sounds dismal, but in fact, a sizable number of affluents are expecting to actually spend more in certain categories over the next several months, particularly things like travel, food, and groceries. Across the board, in the 8 categories we asked about, affluent spending in the next 6 months was expected to be similar to or exceeding what was spent in the last 6 months. So that's quite good news. We should note that the expectation for spending on remodeling and renovation is going to suffer the most, but that's really coming off of the COVID years when so many households focused on home improvements, just simply because they were continuing to spend a great deal of time at home. So therefore, a lot of home improvements were done. We've certainly seen the anecdotal evidence in terms of how the sales at Home Depot and Lowe's, but they're starting to fall back as households have really done the renovations and changes that they wanted. So, again, let's return to today's topic. Essentially 3/4 of all affluents are telling us they expect to spend the same or more on alcohol in the near term compared to the last 6 months. So, in some ways, this all sounds inconsistent. There's high levels of concern about the economy and inflation, but continued spending at reasonable levels. And this really comes back to the financial insulation that we talk about. When we ask them how they feel about their own family's finances today compared to a year ago, 2/3 of affluents are saying they're the same or even better than they were. And as we've seen in the past, affluents are enthusiastic about their own prospects, even when they sour on the U.S. economy as a whole. So, here we see that 29% of affluents believe their family finances are going to be even better 6 months from now. So, in the end, is it time to celebrate with a toast, or is it time to, essentially drown our sorrows? So let's look at that by checking out the basics of the relationship that affluents have with alcohol. Now, the bulk of spending on alcoholic beverages by affluents is for at-home consumption. And slightly more than 2/3 of all dollars are spent on alcohol that's going to be consumed at home. However, there's a sizable portion that's coming from alcohol that's bought and consumed on, on premise, places like restaurants, bars, sporting events, anything of that ilk. In past webinars, we've talked quite a bit about how much affluents love to travel. So it's really not a shock for us to see a significant spending on alcoholic beverages while traveling, $2.8 billion a year, or about 8% of the total expenditure. Now, it's more than just special occasions, things like birthdays, anniversaries, and graduations. The majority of affluents are consuming one or more glasses of alcohol in the past 7 days. We note that men have higher rates of consumption than women. Wine is the beverage most likely to be consumed overall, with nearly 6 in 10 affluents consuming in the past 7 days. Wine consumption is roughly even between men and women. However, as we look at some of the other categories, we're going to see differences by gender. So male consumption of beer and ale is close to twice as high as women, while men are more than twice as likely as women to consume brown goods, whiskey, bourbon, rye. White goods, gin, rum, tequila, and vodka have a closer alignment between the genders, although more men consume than women. Now, purchases are not relegated, as I said, to just the special occasions. We see that 4 in 10 affluents bought liquor or wine by the case in the past year. 1 in 5 bought liquor by the case, and slightly more than 1 in 4 bought wine by the case. You'll understand why in a few slides when we talk about why bulk purchases make sense in affluent lives. But what we also wanted to bring out was, affluents tend to be explorers and experimenters, just in general. They tend to be brand loyal in many ways. And certainly with alcoholic beverages, we see that nearly 3/4 of them are saying that they found the alcoholic beverage brands and products they really like, and they stick with them. Yet at the same time, we're also seeing a significant portion who say that they will repurchase a new beer, wine, or other alcoholic beverage that they've tried and liked. So these are people who are willing to try new things, and if they like it, they will continue to purchase. Now, we know that affluents in general exhibit this intense interest in the world around them. As a rule, they're inquisitive, they're curious, they're knowledgeable about the world because they spend time researching and understanding. And interest in learning more about alcoholic beverages and trying new beer, wine, or spirits is very high for many affluents. So it's a good thing for marketers because they're willing to be able to try new things and to understand, and they're open and receptive to messages. Now we're going to talk more about the connection between food and alcoholic beverages in a little bit, but I did want to show you a little bit about the interest in the new and special, and that extends to things like checking out new restaurants, the fact that almost half of women say they'll order the special or seasonal drinks at restaurants, and fully a third of affluents say they enjoy staying on top of the latest culinary trends. So these two things, are really meshed together. It's part of the psyche, part of how they operate. Excuse me. This interest really in all things surrounding food and beverage really makes affluents open to the marketing messages. They're likely going to be the first to try. When we look at the data, 1/4 of all affluents drinking age are early adopters when it comes to alcoholic beverages. And really importantly, about 1/3 of them influence others about alcoholic beverages. I apologize. I have 2 dogs here that are not behaving well today. My colleague Assad, thankfully, while I mute my mic, will take you through some interesting findings from the Ipsos alcohol consumption tracker about recent changes in consumption. So over to you, Assad.
Thanks, Tony. Good timing for the segue. So what I'm going to go through in this section is just some of the changes we've seen in the course of the last, 2.5, 3 years of how consumption behavior for alcohol among affluents have changed in light of the pandemic. So what you have here are the average servings among affluent consumers of different types of alcoholic beverages. And the navy blue line at the top represents total alcohol. And while there have been varying degrees of consumption throughout the pandemic, you can see there are clear lifts in most recent periods. This was primarily driven by beer and ale, as you can see in the yellow line, in addition to whiskeys, bourbons, and rye in particular. We'll come back to the reasons behind this, but we want to start with understanding what is driving some of these lifts. In addition to some of the more recent trends for beer and whiskey, there are some newer types of beverages that it's important for the audience to understand, and they're related to RTDs, which are ready to drink beverages, and this comprises of pre-mixed cocktails and things of that nature, as well as hard seltzers. So for those that are not familiar, a large brand would be White Claw in that category, and these have been growing at a fairly rapid pace throughout the pandemic as well. Next slide, please. So one of the major reasons and shifts we've seen on alcohol consumption, while the majority, as Tony alluded to earlier, occurs at home, there's been a lot of shifts in the food service sector as a result of all the lockdowns and restrictions that we've been facing. So when you're looking at a general distribution of servings of alcohol between residential, which would be at home, represented by the blue lines, versus on-premise, which would be in restaurants or other food service establishments, which would be the yellow, you can see there's clear differences, and that gap widened right at the start of the pandemic. Now with affluents, which if we look at the solid yellow line, especially on premise, they always tended to skew higher towards consuming alcohol on premise. It speaks to earlier points about their preference for trying new things and going to new restaurants as well. And while that kind of dissipated at the start, it's been gradually growing over the last couple of months as well. And that would be part of the reason why we're seeing such a solid acceleration of particular types of alcohol beverage consumption in most recent quarters. Next slide, please. In most cases, if we were to break down the type of alcoholic beverages consumed by affluents, beer by far is the highest, but it's not unique to this cohort. It's pretty much in line with how non-affluents would consume beer as well. What we see consumed at a higher level or rate among affluents is wine, where you see 26% of all alcoholic beverages are attributed to that particular category, and then also whiskeys, bourbons, and rye. And those two really drive a lot of the consumption and behavior and appeal among this group. Next slide, please. Now, what's unique and interesting about wine consumption among affluents is that there's a higher tendency of consuming wine at home. Of course, they do order wine when they go out to eat at restaurants, but in general, compared to other cohorts, there is a higher tendency to consume wine at home. And part of the reason is the dynamic of the occasion of when they drink wine. It's usually in more intimate settings. So if they're at home, it would be likely with a loved one or by themselves. And it also explains why beer generally tends to be at even development among this cohort, because in most cases, beer tends to skew towards larger groups and larger occasions. So it's an important dynamic to understand within wine and what makes it unique for this group. It's in home and in smaller groups and settings. Next slide, please. Now, there are various drivers and reasons for why consumers drink, but one of the main reasons that we've seen a lot of the changes in recent periods are affluent consumers, when they're seeking alcohol occasions, tend to more likely consume it with a type of food. And in addition to that, they always tended to consume it for connecting with others. And those two factors alone are one of the reasons we're seeing a lot of the growth in recent periods. If we go look at the growing dynamics as well, we see similar growth, especially compared to prior to the pandemic, connecting with others and eating more food. And this explains the fact that most consumers, including affluent, have been in isolation for the majority of the period of the pandemic. With the opening of restaurants and the need to reconnect, these two factors alone are attributing to a lot of the growth that we're seeing among this group. And I think it's fairly important to understand and appreciate the meal dynamics when it comes to alcohol consumption. So back to you, Tony, to speak to that section.
Fantastic. Well, thank you. Thank you, Assad. And thankfully, affluents are not drinking on an empty stomach. For affluents, food and beverages are experiences that they enjoy together, especially with friends and family. So a large part of affluent lives is about sharing, sharing the benefits that they have and the wealth that they have. They love to entertain friends and family. They extend hospitality both at home and at restaurants, bars, other venues outside the home. In fact, when we look at the data, more than 80% of affluents say that they entertain at home in an average month, and 2/3 of them entertain outside the home in an average month. Roughly 1 in 5 do so 3 or more times a month. So that adds up to a lot of occasions where food and beverages are highlighted. And that brings me back to that point we made earlier about the bulk buying, about buying by the case. As you can tell from, or as you can assume from the fact that they entertain as often as they do, they need to keep a well-stocked, they need to keep their bar well-stocked with both wine and spirits. Now, for the most part, premium wine and spirits brands, and most important for them, when we look at this, when affluents entertain, they entertain well. So the majority of them are telling us that when they do entertain, they only serve the best food and beverages. More than half of them say that premium liquor brands are worth the additional cost. And the food and beverage connection extends to virtually every aspect of their lives. 54% saying they go out of their way to make sure that fine food and wine is part of every vacation they take. So this is a clear connection and an important connection for affluents. Speaking of travel and leisure pursuits, we also note that a large portion of affluents take their love of food and wine even further. They attend food and wine festivals. They sample beverages at breweries, vineyards, or taking part in wine tastings while they're on a trip. It's not a huge portion of the population, but there are plenty of gourmands among the affluent population. 8% of them are telling us, 8% of affluent wine drinkers, I should say, are telling us that they are making sure that they have dinner at a Michelin restaurant, a Michelin-starred restaurant, as part of their travel plans. So these are people who are very much committed to fine foods and beverages. Speaking of that, Assad's got some interesting information on the connection.
So I think it's important to understand there are unique strategies to pair different type of alcoholic beverages, depending on the food you want to pair with. In some cases, there's probably no surprises here. So beer tends to pair better with fast food type of products, whether it's burgers, pizzas, down to sandwiches. Wine tends to skew more towards formal or heavier meal type dinner fare, whether you're talking about pasta, seafood, or red meats. Now, it's interesting with spirits. Generally, what you see is that for a type of full course meal, again, things that tend to happen more so in restaurants, is when you might have a type of spirit, whether it's prior to your meal or maybe afterwards. It's interesting just to see the difference between whiskeys, bourbons, and rye favored towards red meats versus gin, rum, tequila, and vodkas towards seafood. Over to you.
Thank you. So we've covered some of the basics. Let's focus on some specifics about Affluent's love of wine. As we mentioned earlier, wine is the alcoholic beverage most likely to be consumed by Affluents in the past week. Not necessarily the servings, but certainly the percentage of Affluents drinking. Now, an even higher number, 60%, tell us that they buy wine at least once a month or even more frequently. Most of these wine purchases are taking place in the retail stores, but a sizable number of Affluents have made the commitment to the grape, if you will, by joining wine clubs to get regular shipments, to check out new offerings from the vintners. To Affluents, a price of $45 separates premium wine from essentially everyday wine. And slightly more than half of them spend about $50 or more on have had a bottle of wine or spent $50 or more on a single bottle of wine. Now, approximately 1 in 4 Affluents purchases fine wine on a monthly basis. Given the high consumption, the fact that they buy in bulk, it's also not surprising to see that 4 in 10 Affluents have a wine refrigerator or a wine cellar in their home, installed in their home. Clearly these are people who are very serious about wine. In fact, slightly more than half of Affluent wine drinkers consider themselves knowledgeable about wine. So where do they get the knowledge and what or who inspires them when it comes to wine? Well, almost 2/3 of wine drinkers tell us that they learn or get inspiration about wine by browsing in retail stores. And that really points to the critical need for point of purchase influence. For many, the path to purchase is incomplete until they're browsing the aisles of the store and making those on-the-spot decisions. Now, outside of the point of purchase, there are other sources of inspiration and learning, but they pale in comparison to what is happening at the retail store. So 1 in 3 rely on recommendations from family and friends. A similar number say that they taste or sample wine before purchasing. It really comes back to the importance of on-premise consumption because it's really showing that about 1 in 3 wine drinkers learn about wine by trying them at a restaurant, and 1 in 4 have visited a vineyard. Now, at the point of purchase, and when the purchase is actually happening, it's not going to surprise anybody that color, price, varietal are the biggest considerations in the purchase. Pointing to the willingness to experiment and try new things, only 1 in 5 state that they've previously enjoyed a wine as one of the top factors at the point of purchase. So they are not necessarily buying on past behavior. Interestingly, fewer than 1 in 10 wine drinkers mentions the brand or the vintner as a top attribute when they're making that purchase. It's significantly lower than what we see for beer or liquor purchasers. It really points up to the competitive nature of the selection process at the point of purchase. Now, in general, Affluents are smart shoppers. Really, thanks to being inquisitive, thanks to researching before buying. Affluent wine drinkers buy up and down the price spectrum. Nearly 3/4 of Affluents buy red wine. And the median price point for a typical bottle is $17.75. But roughly 1 in 7 red wine buyers spends $30 or more on a typical bottle. The price point for white wine is typically lower than red, but Affluents are typically, I say typically a lot, willing to spend more per bottle for champagne. Here, nearly 1 in Affluents will spend $50 or more on a purchase of champagne. Now, Assad has some further data on Affluent purchases by varietal.
I think the main takeaway here is the strong preference for reds. So this reflects, over the course of the month, cab savs, for example, 30% of affluent drinkers would prefer or have consumed a cab sav over the course of that month. And the two types you can see, whether it's a cab sav or a red blend, by far make up the majority of the share. Others, whether it's Merlot, Pinot Noirs, also are fairly high, and Chardonnays among the white. I think the main takeaways here is, while you see the strong preference for reds, a lot of this is driven by the pairing with food behavior that we see is incidental with affluent consumers. And again, wine is one of those categories that has the highest level of pairing with any type of food. And that type of preference of which type of varietals might be better paired with food might be driving the decision and the reasoning behind some of these rankings.
So from a personal perspective, let's move on to spirits. I personally do love a good martini. Straight up, dry, no dirty martinis for me, thank you. While gin may not be the #1 choice for affluents when it comes to spirits, they do generally enjoy a good drink. In the past 7 days, we see that more than half of affluents consumed 1 or more glasses of distilled spirits. About 1 in 3 drank vodka. 1 in 4 drank whiskey and or tequila, and slightly less drank bourbon, rum, and or gin. Now, as I mentioned earlier, affluents tend to agree that premium liquor is worth the extra price. And we see from the data that a large majority of them have spent $50 or more on a single bottle of spirits. And in a similar vein, as we talk about affluents entertaining, more than half of them purchase liquor on a monthly basis. So again, this is an important aspect of affluent lives. 57% of affluents who drink distilled spirits consider themselves knowledgeable about their beverage of choice. That's just slightly higher than the percentage of wine drinkers who consider themselves knowledgeable. So where does that knowledge come from? Well, again, the retail store is a great source of inspiration, although it's less so than the impact on wine purchasers. It may have to do with the fact that there are generally fewer brands per category compared to the variety and the complexity of wine offerings, or it could come down to the fact that there's greater consistency in flavor for distilled spirits brands. Similar to wine, though, other sources of inspiration that impact the purchase decision are things like recommendations from friends and family, tasting, sampling, previous experience at, such as at a restaurant or bar. Now, at the point of purchase, flavor is still king. It far surpasses the other attributes. Price is definitely a consideration. But flavor is more important to affluents than price, and that's not surprising given what we see in other areas of affluent behavior. It's worth noting that 28% of spirits drinkers rank brand as one of the top attributes. And although that is almost 3 times higher than the brand importance for wine purchase, it really shows that there's still a fair amount of volatility at the point of purchase. So there's a real need for spirits marketers to make sure that their brand is being well displayed and well represented in store as the decision is being made. Now, we often speak about the generational shifts happening among affluents. The ACT has some interesting perspective on really how this materializes in the alcoholic beverage consumption patterns. Assad?
So even among affluent consumers, it's still not a one-size-fits-all when it comes to the types of alcohol categories preferred by cohort. As you can see, there are some distinctive differences between younger and older affluent alcohol consumers. In general, older cohorts tend to consume more wines. So you can see 40% among seniors, 33% among boomers, and then in contrast among Gen Z and millennials around 21%. And similarly for spirits, you can see a higher level of consumption among older cohorts versus younger. In contrast, what you see is beer by far accounts for the largest share of different categories among Gen Z and millennials, 43%, compared to only 28 or 33% for seniors and boomers respectively. Also, the category that I mentioned earlier that's been growing quite a lot since the pandemic has been driven by these younger cohorts. So your RTDs, your ready-to-drink alcoholic beverages, as well as hard seltzers, has been growing, mainly attributed to younger generations. And the reasoning behind this is there's been a lot of shifts towards health and wellness trends, even within overall alcoholic consumption. And the need to have more reduced sugar intake or potentially lower carbs is one of the key reasons for the growth for these categories and why they're encroaching into space for beer, especially among younger cohorts. Next slide, please. Now, different needs will drive different behaviors, and this still applies to the differences between younger and older cohorts among affluent alcohol consumers. Older cohorts, boomers, for example, their needs for alcohol tends to be a bit more functional, and primary reasons food pairings are so highly skewed towards these occasions, whereas for Gen Z and millennials, it's a bit more emotional driven. They're out to have a good time, connect with friends and others, and then de-stress. And it's really important to understand these distinctions among these two cohorts because it applies to how you want to target, communicate, and position any type of communication when it comes to alcohol consumption among these two groups within affluence.
We always pack a lot of information to these webinars, and I hope you find the information useful and insightful. But before we close, let's try to sum up today's presentation into a few salient points for you to take away. The first, really the elephant in the room is, of course, inflation and the impact that it's having due to rising costs, concerns about the potential for a recession. The good news is that affluents continue to feel good about their own personal finances. But even so, they're telling us that they expect their future spending habits to change slightly. Given their substantial nest egg, marketers should continue to focus efforts on this group of affluents because there's clearly the most insulated against difficult financial times. And from past experience, what we've seen certainly over the last 46 years that we've been conducting this study is that they're usually the fastest group to recover from any negative impacts that occur. Assad?
I think also the news of the shift from focus on the pandemic and the restrictions it had to some other headwinds such as inflation still hasn't deterred a lot of consumption to normalize, particularly among the affluent group. I think the desire to entertain and reconnect kind of trumps everything else in the near term. And remember, this group tends to be less impacted by the shifts on inflation overall. So this in turn has helped drive a lot of on-premise alcohol occasions, especially in the last 2 quarters, and that's why we're seeing a lot of lifts in overall consumption in general. Now, in addition to that, and leading from there, we do see a very strong involvement with food and beverage pairings, and that is really one of the crux of when you're looking at alcohol occasions among affluents that you want to kind of focus back on. And while there are different strategies of how you want to pair alcoholic beverages with different types of foods, I think it's important to consider all of these things in totality. The need to reconnect, the ability for people to entertain, and of course to enjoy some of the more basic traits that was limited during a lot of the restrictions that we'd seen is driving a lot of the growth in recent periods.
Thank you, Assad. And, as we close, we can't emphasize enough how important this relatively small group of people are to alcoholic beverage marketers. The affluent population outspends non-affluents by almost 4 to 1. So in essence, 1 out of every $2 spent on alcohol is coming from affluent households. They're clearly a force to be reckoned with in this industry, as well as most of the other industries that we look at. So we're thankful that we're able to provide insight into who these people are, how they think. We hope that what we present today has given you good insight into the relationship they have. And feel free to reach out to Assad or to myself if you have questions or if you'd like further information. But I think we will close on that note today. So thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to talking to you soon.
I just want to thank you guys both so much for today's really interesting presentation, and thank you for all of us who joined us today. If we didn't get to your question, then we will be able to do so by email. You will also receive an email with a direct link to today's recorded presentation, and additionally, you can reference the handouts in your event console for more about the research we shared today. So we welcome the opportunity to speak with you. Please feel free to reach out to us. That now concludes today's webinar. Thank you guys so much.